smart buildings, environmental sensors. So these are sort of the new things that are coming into cities these days. You see this like in um, the really big cities like New York, Tokyo, Japan, Sydney. I think Canberra in Australia is an even more developed city, and a bunch of the Netherlands, the European cities like London, Paris, and I think I forget which city in the Netherlands. I just call it the cycling country. But what do you call this? If you look at these four pictures here, you can tell that's Paris, you can tell that's London, and then C and D are actually Philippine cities. This one, letter C here, is Iloilo City. I think the most, I guess, well-developed city. It's a lot less congested than Manila, but almost as advanced, if not more advanced, than Cebu. Like it has schools, it has like internet, a lot of good infrastructure for parking, cycling, and walking. So the last two pictures here, if I remember correctly, are from Iloilo. So you have like what do you call this? Waterfront here and an esplanade, basically an area where you can walk next to the river. And then it's getting there. It's looking like it could be London, it could be Paris, something like that. So again, just quick reminder, we talked about urban and regional planning as a ongoing collaborative process with urban design as the implementation of those policies in urban planning. But as I mentioned earlier, urban design can also influence urban planning. We just need some very key projects. Like for example, in Cebu, one big project is like urban design project is pedestrianization of Colon area. I'll show you a map of that later on, but it's an old heritage district with a lot of churches, and the local government working together with San Carlos, the University of San Carlos, is finding like possible locations for pedestrianization, meaning streets that are fully open to pedestrians but closed off to vehicles. So it will help the local tourism industry and also improve like the conditions of the built environment. So if you ever went to Colon or the old heritage districts in the Philippines, they're a bit run down, although some of them are a bit better than others, but that's the general trend. Okay, so I'd like to start off with another aside to historical development in Cebu City. This is something I do to just like orient people who are not from the Philippines, so also not from Cebu. So the quick rundown here is from 1500s all the way to 2015, the Cebu City or the Cebu province started out as a sort of Aboriginal tribes that were eventually colonized by the Spanish and then also ceded to the Americans. And then eventually Cebu, together with the Philippines, got its independence after World War II, so as our 1950s. But let's start off with this map. So we have Spain here, where my mouse is. And around 1700, Spain had colonized a big chunk of Southern America and also the Philippines. So those are their major colonies. Canada was still a part of France. And let's see here. We have the Qing Empire in China, and Japan was by itself. And that's basically the situation of the 1700s. So why do we need to learn sort of QGIS? The power of QGIS is in storing data, and it can be population data, any kind of statistical data, and converting it into an image or map. Next week, we'll be learning how to create a map like this. I'll give you the sort of the base map, and then you can add additional data to it. So what you see here is a Cebu province population data map, with dark blue being the highest population and light sort of teal as the least population. So you see, this is as of, I think, 2015, where you see a lot of the population in Cebu province is concentrated here in Cebu City, Mandaue, Lapu-Lapu, a bit of Toledo, Danao. While as you go north and south, the population decreases. And really, as we mentioned earlier, the larger the population, the more dense a city becomes, the more opportunity, but at the same time, there's still a lot of problems with waste pollution and waste management. So anyway, going back 1500s. So the Philippines, Cebu City itself wasn't a city yet, but it was composed of a bunch of local tribes and what we call Rahanates or Rajanates. And then so the usual thing, they were pretty well off. They had like they lived with the land, and then the colonizers came and built cities or small towns. That's and then they usually followed what we call the grid plan. And as I mentioned before, the grid plan was efficient for ancient cities, mostly because they wanted to subdivide land in a fast and efficient way. And then this was copied even by the Spanish when they colonized the Philippines at around 1600s. And then again, the benefits of the grid plan were the ease of mobility because you have the grid penetrating the whole city. You have like multiple access points. But the major issue with the grid plan is that it doesn't do well when the site is sloping or when there's a hilly site and then the grid isn't anymore equal because of the change in the grade of the slope. Okay, so we're reaching like late 1600s, like 1700s. We have here, you see this like white stripes here, the first sort of grid plan in Cebu City, designed according to what they call the Laws of the Indies, which is a Spanish document outlining the urban planning and urban design provisions. So you see here, this is in Fort San Pedro, one of the oldest forts in Cebu, our heritage sites. And then one key tenet of the Laws of the Indies was that major cities or towns needed to have a public square or plaza. And around this public plaza, you would locate your churches, your government buildings like capital offices, and schools as well. And one of the sort of oldest examples of like a fort in the Philippines is the Intramuros. So for those who are familiar with or lived in Manila, you would know this site here. And then we have a short excerpt here from the Laws of the Indies. So, for example, this is the an excerpt from the text itself translated to English. So, having made the selection of the site where the town is to be built, it must be, as already stated, in an elevated and healthy location with the means of fortification. It must have fertile soil and also what you call is people to like plow and like farm. So even back then, like 1690, they already had this idea of what they needed a city to be. And then we still carry on those traditions today. And I think the only difference is that we changed our modes of transportation, our technology, but the concept is kind of still there. Now we need a space for people. And this is an example of the Washington, D.C. plan by Le and Font in 1791. So you see the grid plan, but now it has these diagonal streets. And they use these sort of like as a design flourish. Not really, I can't really say if it was functional or not, but the main purpose was to highlight important monuments in the city. And the idea was that if you have these monuments, people will feel more sort of proud of where they live, and if they get that sense of community. That kind of thinking is not really present in the Philippines because our monuments and heritage sites are mostly hidden behind newer commercial buildings. So that's something I tend to explain to my students, that we need to bring back that kind of thinking. We need to embrace our culture, raise awareness about it, but for the most part, because heritage and culture doesn't bring in the big bucks, the developers tend to go for larger malls, larger sort of globalized projects, not really celebrating local culture, but trying to adopt what's popular abroad. So that's a big issue in the Philippines. And then one key thing here, in the 1910s, Cebu actually had a train station, but it was sort of damaged and sort of unused after World War II, and now it's currently underneath a bunch of our commercial buildings. So it was such a waste that we had a mass transportation system, which we sort of kind of traded away for the fast and easy route of like building more commercial buildings for better economic activity, something like that. And then around this time, 1910s, was also the invention of the private automobile. And you will keep hearing me mention the private automobile over and over again. It's just a uh, big turning point for urban design, because before the private automobile, we had trains and maybe horses as well. In the Philippines and also abroad, cities were sort of defined by how far you could travel in a certain amount of time. In ancient times, cities were very walkable because they had to be. There was no other mode of transportation. Cities could only grow to about like 500, 600 meter in radius. With the invention of the train, cities started what we call leapfrogging. So from one train station to the next train station, and then cities and towns were built around these train stations. When the car came, basically it removed the limiter for urban development, and that basically was the catalyst for urban sprawl. Urban sprawl is the rapid urbanization across vast amounts of land in a short amount of time. So we have here the result, sort of like the beginnings of that sprawl. And this is just to highlight what the old railway in Cebu City looked like. And then in green, you see the railway, and in lighter sort of brown are the proposed sort of new expansions of the streets. And then in darker red here are the actual built streets. So you can see in the southeastern part of the Heritage District of Cebu, you can see it's still a bit kind of grid-ish, more regular sort of subdivisions. And then when you go upwards, it's just all road towards our Capitol building and road towards the Fuente Osmeña Circle, and then some roads here for maybe additional commercial and residential development. And then around this time, 1900s, Europe, and more specifically London, was experiencing a urban boom. So a lot of people were moving from the rural areas to their city centers, and this caused a lot of urban population and a lot of problems with living quality and waste management. So this guy here on the lower right, Ebenezer Howard, wrote a book called The Garden Cities of Tomorrow, basically saying that we need to let cities breathe by adding more open space. And this open space will also be where you have your sewer systems being managed and built. And then why did he call it the Garden Cities of Tomorrow? Because during that time, parks and what they call this open space was rare in urban areas. So he really wanted to talk about gardens. And then over here in the right side, you see the three magnets. This is a page from his book. So what he identified was going on in London during the 1850s and early 1900s was you have the urban areas, which he calls the town, and the rural areas, which he calls the country. So the urban areas had a lot of benefits, a lot of jobs, economic activity, but not much privacy. What they call is a lot of waste. And then the country had less jobs, but it had a lot of sort of nature, beauty. So his idea was to combine both the positive elements of a town and the positive elements of a country to create what he calls a town country. So an area where people can access jobs, find work, but also have the comforts of the rural areas with open parks and clean sort of green areas. And meanwhile, in Cebu City in the 1870s, we didn't have the problem of overpopulation because there was nobody here. Now, there are people here, but we're not as populated as London, New York, and all those other developed countries. So we were still developing, so very few people here. Mostly this area was occupied by the Spanish, wealthy Filipinos, and wealthy Chinese. So a lot of the big Chinese families and businessmen started out in the Colon district, and eventually they moved up into the Ayala area, Mandawi area, and even Lapu-Lapu area when things started to develop faster and faster. And then just sort of as a comparison, this is Manila, the proposed Burnham plan by American architect and also urban planner Daniel Burnham. Just to look at the scale, Cebu City, the first town of Cebu City might be fitting here, well inside Intramuros, where my mouse is. So Cebu City was really one of the lesser populated. It wasn't even a city; it was just a town or municipality back then. Okay, so now we are 1970s Cebu City. So if you see, development is going inwards, and you have a lot of new roads because the private vehicle made it possible to travel all the way up there, and the wealthy families would really prefer to live in their own backyard with a lot of open land. So these roads probably went to private residences and like a private establishments away from the hustle and bustle of like city life here in the heritage. What is the heritage district today? And then here is a aerial map of 1944 Cebu City. You have the port area, you have Plaza Independencia and Fort San Pedro down here. You can see the Fuente Osmeña Circle. And then over here is to the east, you have the Talamban area. I think it's still, no, that's still the Lahug area. That's where IT Park is today. And then to the left is the Guadalupe area. Guadalupe would become the most populated barangay in the Visayas, even I think even until today. So we have Fuentes Mania Circle over here and the Capitol building over here where my mouse is. So a lot of vacant land. And then it's crazy that to think that just in about let's see, 40, the differences in a couple of decades. And this one is Manila in 1945. So I mentioned earlier about the impacts of the World War II in the Philippines. Manila was heavily damaged during the war, so this caused a lot of rebuilding. And as I mentioned before, this was the prime time for architects and new urban planners to sort of stretch out or like practice their creativity. And the modernism movement was in full swing. So we had a lot of these like brutalist, blockish buildings. And then at the same time, we have some pictures here of 1970 Cebu, where our most famous sort of landmark, not the most famous, but one of the most famous landmarks, the Magellan's Cross was built, and you still had vehicles going by this like historical monument. Currently, this is now fully pedestrianized, and I think it's more popular because of it. And then sort of just that, but yeah, I have this, I think it's the wrong slide. This is for like a future discussion. So I'll just skip that. And I think we mentioned Jane Jacobs before, the Town and Country Planning Act, basically making planning more participative, getting the people involved in urban planning and urban design projects. So now we have post-colonial Philippines, like contemporary Cebu City, 2005. And I would just like to highlight how messy the streets have gotten, mostly because of, I'll bring this to the front, bring the front. There really was no regulating, or maybe there were some regulating policies, but they weren't really enforced. And most of the time, wealthy developers would sort of push their agenda or convince the governments because they have the money to like, loosen the, we call it here in Cebu, bayarans, meaning to pay instead of variance. So you have a lot of these subdivision developments, and this is a clear case of urban sprawl where you have large subdivision developments, not really efficient use of land, and this is made possible because of the private automobile. So people, given the chance, will live further away because newer land, cleaner environment, and then our heritage district, which hasn't been maintained properly, I guess, for the past almost 50 years, is becoming more and more sort of unhospitable. But I think in the past 10 years, there have been a lot of projects and what they call proposals to clean up our heritage and like our historical downtown area. But the thing I really want to highlight here is how quickly things can sort of get out of hand. And then it will be useful for us to look at the tools next week, what we can apply to sort of regulate this kind of development so that other areas that are not as populated as Cebu, there's several of them around the Philippines, could control that growth and maybe maintain a more orderly development pattern. So let me just reduce this for the next class. Some of the key development projects around this time, like late 1990s and early 2000s, was the Ayala Business District and the Cebu IT Park. So these are the key sort of economic sort of zones in in Cebu City. The Ayala area is known as one of the more popular malls. This is where most of Cebuanos come to relax. IT Park is where a large amount of what they call it, business process outsourcing (BPOs) offices are. These are basically call centers, and the Philippines taking advantage of the peso to dollar rates, basically hiring Filipinos to work for foreign companies, but the company is based abroad, but the workers are here in the Philippines. So they're getting paid in dollars, which is significantly less than what they would pay workers in the US, for example. So it's a win for the companies and it's a win for the local Cebuanos because they get paid more because it's a foreign sort of company. Okay, and then I think I already discussed this before, and sort of some slides here on population density. We'll just skip that for now. This is more for the GIS portion, but here, this is the one I want to discuss. The spatial planning hierarchy in the Philippines. So in the Philippines, we have sort of four levels of urban planning. Urban design would only be here at the local and municipal level, but as much as possible, it's advised that we should align our urban design goals with the larger urban planning goals. So we have, the four levels are national, regional, provincial, and then the local or municipal level. Some of my sort of mentors who are environmental planners or urban planners suggest that we need a level in between provincial and municipal, what they call a metropolitan level, because a lot of the nuance in planning and design gets lost between the provincial scale and the municipal scale. Most of the time, provinces in the Philippines look like Cebu over here. It's basically one whole island or a section of an island. So that's a very big sort of land area. And then sometimes policies don't really translate well in each municipality or local area. For example, a policy that would work in northern Cebu might not work for southern Cebu, mostly because of the geographical constraints. Maybe southern Cebu is more prone to other more kind of different kinds of issues than northern Cebu. So the key thing here is why we have these different levels, because different areas have different issues and opportunities that need to be considered. But anyway, how the sort of national all the way down to the municipal government creates their plans and sort of policies is threefold. We have the physical and comprehensive land use plans, basically talking about like how big development should be, where they should be located, physical factors like where we can and cannot build, is it too hilly, etc. And then the socio-economic development plans looking at the behavior and the demographics of that area. For example, you can't have a, what do you call this, a large mall inside a municipality with less than 5,000 people. So it's not feasible. So this would guide development to what do you call this, develop where it's like most appropriate. But for the most part, developers in the Philippines are very good at finding locations for new malls. And then lastly, we have the investment programs. These are basically the budgets for these different sort of government programs. So there's a national level budget, a regional level, provincial, etc., etc. And ideally, or supposedly, each of these different government levels would have their documents ready for kind of public distribution. But if you do a quick Google search, there are a lot of regions that even don't have a physical framework plan. There's a lot of regions that have socioeconomic development plans, but no physical framework plans. Investment programs are the most difficult thing to find because like money is very hush hush in the Philippines, especially with the government. But that's why starting with urban design might be a better alternative than starting from national or even municipal level. Small sort of urban design projects might have better traction, and it might be easier. It will be definitely easier to secure funds because you're working at such a smaller scale. And then just like a quick sort of overview of the national framework objectives, some of the key issues in the Philippines as of this is around 2015-ish, and projecting it all the way to 2030. Food security is the number one issue in the Philippines. Not so much a problem in the urban areas, but in the rural areas, they have difficulty getting food. And next is the environmental stability, so preserving what existing ecosystems we have, and sometimes the influence of the wealthy developers, especially those who own the malls, override or kind of usurp the importance of environmental stability, and the government is kind of like flip-flopping on that. Sometimes they preserve it, sometimes they don't. It really depends on how much money is being thrown around. And then we have rational urban development, so encouraging sustainable growth of cities. So this is one of our sort of key issues in our urban design class. How do we create, or how do we regulate urban development so that it becomes rational, it's logical? Because currently in the Philippines, urban planning is very ad hoc. It's left to the markets. So what do I mean by that? It's left to whoever has the money. Basically, the wealthiest can buy the most land, and they develop it however they wish, without consideration for the environment and the people in that area. So that's why there's a very big equity issue in the Philippines. So the rich get richer, the poor get poorer. That story. It's been the same story since I was a child, like 30 years ago. Next, we have spatial integration. How do we connect the different areas of in the Philippines? So encouraging again, linking the consumption and production areas. Consumption is where are the goods and services being consumed. For example, in agriculture, land for agriculture is very far away from the urban areas because you need a lot of open space. And then how do you transport those goods and services to the urban areas where they are consumed? This currently, I think we're having an issue with our onions. Onions have become surprisingly expensive, where they were, I think they doubled, maybe even tripled in price over the past few months. And then the next issue here is equitable access to physical and natural resources. So kind of connecting to the spatial integration. So how do we distribute land, manage land, and all that stuff? So, and then what we have here, when we have equitable uses of land, we also need public and private sector partnerships, because the big issue here with the Philippines, the government is understaffed and underpaid. We really have to rely on the private sector to provide the staff, the education, and the training to create, and even the funds to create these infrastructure projects. If you see the third bridge here in Cebu City, that is a private-public partnership. And I'm sure in your local areas outside of Cebu, you also have some similar projects. And I would like to hear if you have any later on. Next, people empowerment, again, engaging the stakeholders, something that is very difficult to do in the Philippines because of the class gap. The urban rich and the urban poor, unsurprisingly, they don't like each other. So how do you bridge that gap? How do you get communication lines open where the rich always feel like they're more superior and the poor are agitated, angry, and then rightfully so. So how do you open up that communication? And then recognition of rights of indigenous people. We have a lot actually of indigenous people in the Philippines. This is also an issue in Australia. They have indigenous tribes that they're so slowly trying to give back the land to, but unfortunately they can't give it all back because those lands have already been developed. So how do you compensate those indigenous people? And then finally, market orientation, which is, I think, the current default of planning in the Philippines, all about who makes the most money. And then we'll be touching a bit on that, I think, in the MUP 204 class. I think that's for second year, or maybe, I'm not sure. The syllabus is still they keep updating it, and I'm a bit behind. Okay. Here is the Philippine Development Plan for 2017 to 2022. So this talks about the socioeconomic aspects of development. and it's basically a hodgepodge of like what the Philippine national Philippine government wants to happen, and then whether it's actually happening is debatable. Like it really depends on the municipality and the city whether they can sort of reach this goal of a healthy and resilient Philippines. So underneath these are sub goals. So building a high trust society, transforming towards equity and resiliency, increasing growth potential. So a lot of like very good sounding stuff. But how do we apply that? And then if you want a copy of this, I can upload it to Canvas. But it's really just a lot of uh, how do I say this in a good way? It's a lot of good intentions, but sometimes it doesn't come through. I guess that applies to everywhere as well. Governments always want to have this like very big ideas, but executing it is a big issue. That's why I think urban design is very key again, because we can just start with our local communities, really work with people that we know, and then hopefully when you graduate with this degree, if you work in government, if you work in academe, you can sort of create your own community. For me, teachers have a sort of unique opportunity in that in the Philippines, our campuses, especially university campuses, are very large, and that's a lot of land that needs management. So I don't think the University of San Carlos has some kind of urban planning commission or group committee. So I that's where my interest is now currently. That's why I've been a bit, what do you call this, unprepared for our class today, because I've been trying to figure out what's happening in the university and other projects that are going on in Cebu. But anyway, I'm highlighting this specific goal, the responsive, people-centered, technology-enabled, and clean governance goal is because this is where we can find sort of urban design and urban planning sort of principles can be applied. So participatory governance. This is a key issue in urban design as well as urban planning, because you want to seek citizen participation. And then seamless service delivery ensured is a bit honestly, it's a bit like of a lofty goal, but again, going towards digitalization, that's why we're learning QGIS. So the sooner the Philippines and like Cebu as well gets these like digitalization programs done, like making sure the barangay halls are equipped properly with computers, going digital, going paperless, services will be a lot better. But another issue here is the safe, resilient, and sustainable communities built. So this is even more related to urban design. Some of the issues we mentioned before, food security, equity, all goes back down to what they call this, housing. In the Philippines, housing is a key issue because we have a lot of informal settlements, similar to what's going on in India, where we have cities with high-rise hotels, high-rise commercial buildings, but right next to it are like really compact informal settlements because the developers don't care about them. The government doesn't either. So this is where designers like us come in to sort of tip the scales a bit more balanced so that we can have better housing for those less fortunate. And why is it good for those people to have better housing? Because they're the workers in the city. If you notice in Cebu, workers and also maybe some other parts of Philippines, the working class, when you go to a mall, they don't really say hi, they don't say good morning. It's because they're most likely living in low quality houses. And then it's really unfortunate because in Singapore, housing is one of the first things they try to solve, and then you can see the impact of that. I think in other countries as well, like the Netherlands and Japan, and even like Australia, if the working class has proper housing, development is even faster and more profitable. I don't know why developers don't see that. I guess it's just because it takes Hello, hello. Sorry. Talking about energy, the power cut. So I'm now on data, so we can continue. Just one of the hazards of living in the Philippines. Okay, where was I? Where did I cut off? I think it was somewhere around here. Also, audio check if you guys can hear me. Hello? Can someone
Hello, sir.
confirm? Okay, there we go. Thank you. All right. Okay, going back. Sige. So, yes, our urban design can also be used to create better housing. And as I mentioned before, housing is important because of what do you call this? Majority of your citizens need to live nearby the city. And then if there isn't affordable housing, they tend to squat. That's what's happening in the Philippines, where there's no affordable housing. They just find a vacant plot of land, pitch up their own house, and then just like go from there. And then if we provide better housing, um, they wouldn't need to squat. And then another issue of squatting or like informal settlement is like these houses are also not very resilient. And the big problem in the Philippines is we have yearly typhoons. So they build their houses, they get destroyed every year, and then they have to rebuild it again, basically making them even poorer. So they're kind of stuck in this poverty, and that's what we're trying to solve. At least for the architects and engineers, I think it can also relate to this like issue. Urban design can also help out with this by identifying key locations for housing and really identify what kind of behavior patterns, what kind of jobs, how what kind of people are living in these like informal settlements. And then again, just showing this what do you call this? Targets and accomplishments, basically lower poverty rates, poverty incidences in the Philippines as of the 2000s, mostly because what do you call this? Uh, we weren't as affected by one of the bigger dips in the national economy, the global financial crisis of 2008, because we mostly traded with China and I think Asia. And then one of the bigger dips as well was the pandemic, which we're coming out of from like 2019. I think even until now, we still have some restrictions and slowly recovering, but not really up to pre-pandemic, almost over pre-pandemic levels. So in blue here, that's the sort of world average of like economic performance. And then Asia is in blue, or the ASEAN countries. That's the Asia, Southeast Asia countries. And then developing, emerging and developing Asia countries are in orange. And then China here is in yellow. So notice the developing countries and China are recovering faster than the rest of the world. So Philippines might be included in that. And then talking about the national investment programs, it's really difficult to find any that are publicly available. So the
Sir,
most I
let's
can
say
do,
you're not
I'm
screen
not
sharing.
sharing my screen.
No, sir.
Sorry about that. Okay, I got too excited. Sorry. Oops. That happens a lot. So feel free to interrupt the moment that you don't see anything on the screen. Okay. Anyway, here, global financial crisis 2008. Asia wasn't hit as badly as what do you call this? The rest of the world, specifically China and the developing countries. But now, after the pandemic, China and developing Asian countries are recovering even faster than the rest of the world. So there's a lot of opportunities here uh, in the Philippines. We just need to manage it. And next, national investment programs, again, difficult to find. So the most I can do is talk about the Department of Budget and Management. And really what they do is manage taxes. Where do the taxes come from? Who needs to pay the taxes? And there, in the Philippines, as well as any other country, there's a lot of different kinds of taxes. But that's really where the source of money or the funds of governments come from, like taxes. Okay, this is a short history of the National Investment Program of the Kanang Budget Commission. We don't really need to go into that right now. Here's a sample form. of like projects. For example, I think for each municipality, they have some kind of form where they lay out what project they have, what kinds of services they need, and the total amount to sort of create or like fund that project. Excuse me. And this is another example of that. This one is from the Cagayan Valley. This is a region development program. So you can see the investment costs here. I think this is in the millions of PHPs. For example, assistance to disadvantaged municipalities. The agency is the Department of, I forget what DILG stands for. Department of, I, yeah, we'll just Google that later. And the funding source is the GAA, another government organization. But I really want to focus on the amount that they are requesting for the assistance of disadvantaged municipalities. That's about 82.39 million pesos. So these kinds of projects are not cheap by any means. And then municipal development usually costs around this much, just to give you like a perspective of how much these projects cost. And again, this highlights the importance of urban design because we can go way lower. Urban design projects can be funded at around 500,000 pesos, so a fraction of the municipal costs. So if we have key small projects, we can have sort of better impact. And then over here is the CLUP guidebook. It's almost 2:30. Maybe we can review it. We can push this discussion to next meeting where we review the contents of the CLUP guidebook. But anyway, this talks about how we optimize land, how we promote public safety, how we preserve culture, and then promote the rational and orderly growth of a city and municipality and or municipality. And then in the Philippines, I touched on before, there are several different kinds of zones, and each zones would have their specific use. And then the current trend today is to sort of have flexible zoning. So for example, if you have a commercial zone, it's not just purely a restaurant or an office building, but you would also sneak in some residential uses in there as well. The idea being that if you have more mixed use zones, you don't need to sprawl as much, meaning you get more uses on a single plot of land versus just one single use, which causes you to spread out. So over here, we have a map of Manila. You can see most of the commercial zones are nearby the port. And in between the port and the commercial zones are the residential areas because it makes sense. The people who need to work at the port need to live nearby. The people who need to work at the commercial areas also live nearby the commercial areas. And then sort of sandwich in between, I think this is Quezon City, if I'm not mistaken, sandwich between another residential zone and the commercial area are the institutional zones. So these are your government buildings, your schools, your museums, etc. So that is really where the center is, like similar to what we mentioned before, that in grid planning, the center of a town or a city is really your government buildings, your churches, and other institutional uses. And basically, if you are familiar with the zoning, you can clearly see where the center of any municipality or city in the Philippines. So you have Antipolo City here. You can see the grid plan, very large swaths of land for residential, and you have the institutional zones here in the center. In Cebu City here on the immediate right, you have a really big chunk of commercial land, then followed by industrial uses. So these are the port areas and factories. But you don't see a lot of the institutional zones are very small. We don't have like large areas for institutional zones. I think it's also because the scale of the Cebu City is very, what do you call this, larger than most cities in the province. The institutional zones are really down here near the port area. That's where our Capitol building is. The schools are spread out throughout the northern and but not really southeastern and southwestern portions of the city. The Talamban campus is here where my mouse is, and there are a bunch of schools here. If you see the sort of the dark blue, that's where the institutional high schools, the government buildings are. Na ako yung signal kaya nag-data ko. Sorry. So here is a comprehensive land use plan showing like the section of what is applied in the comprehensive land use plan. So we divide the island into a forest area, an upland area, a lowland area, and a coastal and marine area. And for these specific areas, you have different organizations. You have the sort of forest land use plan handled by the Department of Environmental, and I really forget the abbreviations, but the DENR is in charge of the forest land use plan. The HLURB is in charge of the comprehensive land use plan. The Department of Agriculture is in charge of agriculture and fisheries. So it really becomes more and more complicated the closer you look at it, where there are different organizations, different plans, different governing bodies for specific areas in the city. And for me, the reason why I think it's so hard to coordinate any kind of rational plan, um, a key thing here is that the zoning map for Cebu City hasn't been updated since I think the 2000s. It's already 2020, 2023 actually, and it's still not there. It's just the coordination and the logistics is so complicated, and people are like so busy doing other things, and we don't have like a clear communication between the two, between several government institutions with the internet problems, brownouts, power outages. That we're managing this thing becomes very, very complex. So hopefully by next week, we'll go through each of these like different tools, steps, and then it will sort of help you, especially if you work in the government sector and the academe, parse out the different elements so you can really kind of maybe propose your own projects and help your local communities. So what are the different sort of programs and steps in the creation of a comprehensive land use plan? There, it's all listed down here. The main issue is really getting it done, like really enforcing it. So number one is discuss the need to prepare or update the CLUP. That's always the case. It needs to be updated, I think, every 3 years or at least annually. But annually, I think is a bit difficult, mostly because the timeline for one comprehensive land use plan, if you see here where my mouse is, takes about 18 months. And the actual might even take longer. So maybe every 3 years, 4 years, you can have a decent system or like decent timeline for creating the plan, evaluating it, and then updating it again. So it's 18 months to make, maybe another 18 months to review. So, and then you update again on the third 18 months. So like every 3 years, more or less. And then let's see here. So you identify the need for a CLUP, you discuss what resources are available, you create your team, usually a mix between private and public officials and also professionals. Orient the team. It seems very straightforward when you actually get these people in a room because of their different personalities, different agendas. It's hard to make them work together. And also, another big issue is the funding. So that is another, I think everywhere, even in the university, funding is a very big issue. We have several events in a year. Securing that funding, looking for sponsors is a nightmare. So I just want to go through the activities here. 2 months for organization. That includes preparation of work program, identifying the stakeholders who is like impacted by your project, setting the vision or goal setting. That's about 3 months. And then next is analyzing the situation, like what's going on in your project site. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 months. That includes data gathering, mapping, needs issues analysis, cross-sectoral analysis, all the analysis. And then finally, what they call goals and objectives setting. So goals and objectives workshop, establishing thrusts and strategies. And then finally, by month 10, they can start to prepare the land use plan, which is given about 3 months. For context, in the Philippines, architectural work, whenever we get a project, from my experience, whether it's a hospital or a house, usually is done in 2 months. So the fact that this is given an extra month means that it's really very difficult to create this land use plan and like a developing strategies for said land use plan. So all of that really would reach you at the month 15, and then you need to create the draft of the zoning ordinances by at the same time, month 15. Conduct a public hearing. The public hearing is given here 3 months from month 16 to month 18, where current, as far as I know, public participation is very difficult. Even in Sydney, they usually have a lot of controversies because even that light rail project, apparently there was very little public participation. What they did was they had a survey um, near, not really near, while the project was being constructed. So a lot of people didn't know what was going on in front of their like road, and then at the same time they're given the survey. What do you think about our railway project that's happening right now? Do you agree or do you disagree? And it's already being constructed. So if it's difficult for countries like Australia and America, it's even more difficult for countries like the Philippines, where logistics and organization is really not yet there, mostly because of technological problems, and also it could be an attitude problem as well. So who is inside the comprehensive land use planning group? You have the local committees, the planning officers, architects and professionals, engineers, urban planners, um, government specialists, environmental specialists. They also include the support group, encoders, writers, draftsperson, people who know how to use the computers, and some government officials here, representative of housing, DepEd, that's the Department of Education, legal experts, and real estate developers. So just looking at that list, can you imagine the type of people in that room? You have teachers, you have young professionals, maybe even some students, and then some people in the room to actually communicate is difficult. My experience, I'm just working mostly with the academe, even chasing after teachers to come to our like coordination meetings, because the thing with architecture teachers is that they're also practicing as architects. So they have their own businesses on top of teaching. And then that's usually the norm because there really is no architecture teacher that's just only teaching, because that's how can they teach when they're not applying? So that's a big issue. Anyway, I'm getting off topic. But yeah, the key thing here, there's several different groups, working groups that need to create this comprehensive land use plan. And what we're doing here in class in this course is sort of to replicate that, but it's a lot easier because you're only one person. Or maybe if you want, we could work in groups. But since some of you are not from Cebu, maybe you could work from some people who are near you. But I think for the most part, we can do this individually just to like see the different processes and familiarize ourselves with that. And then let me see, time check, to 11. Finally, the last few points here in Metro Cebu, the urban design and urban planning sort of policies are currently being worked on or proposed. We have the roadmap study for sustainable urban development in Metro Cebu, basically a cooperation between 13 municipalities and cities, all the way from Danao City in the north down to Karkar City. And sort of the key players are Cebu City, Mandaue City, and Lapu-Lapu City because they have the most resources. And they're working in partnership with the local Cebu City government and also the provincial Cebu City government, as well as international support in the form of the Japan International Cooperation Agency, or JICA. Basically, we hired Japanese planners and professionals to study what's going on in the Philippines, and they shared their studies with Cebuano planners and architects and engineers, and they created this sort of plan. And some of the key issues in the Metro Cebu area: septage and sewerage, number one; solid waste management, number two; and then eventually you see here traffic congestion. You've experienced it if you live in Cebu. Water supply and resources, population increase, public transportation, informal settlers, roads, bridges, and transport infrastructure development, salt water intrusion, which is a tricky one because we're an island, and salt water is apparently seeping into our deep wells, and then drainage issues sort of connected with the waste management, and then dumping site and sanitary landfill. So really it's a waste problem. We have a lot of people living together and our sewage systems can't cope with it anymore. And the biggest problem is that our maps of our sewage systems in Metro Cebu are not updated. So good luck trying to find, trying to even begin to solve the problem without mapping out where your existing sewerage are. But yeah, that's the current situation. I can also provide a copy for this for your reference. And then I think we can, oh, we can still go. Okay. We have like another 10 minutes. So there was some planning policies in place as of 2000. It was called the Metro Cebu Land Use and Transportation Study, or MCLUTS, MCLUTS, and it proposed a similar solution to JICA. JICA probably built on a similar thinking, where Cebu City, Mandaue City, and Lapu-Lapu City would become decentralized and have a controlled spread of urban development. So if you see here, I'll just print the screen so I can write on it. I'll go to Paint. This was developed 1990s, maybe 1980s to 1990s. So the key thing here that is identified, that is sort of related to our topic next week, is the idea of a growth limit. So cities cannot grow indefinitely. There has to be a limit. Otherwise, you'll risk a lot of adverse environmental impacts as well as losing a lot of key natural resources. Maybe I shouldn't have made it red. I'll just make it green. So this line here was the identified growth boundary of Metro Cebu, meaning we're not supposed to build beyond this line. One key reason is that since Cebu is an island, it slopes upwards. So I think a 3D map would be better. So let's see, Cebu City. Going to maps. Wrong map, this one. And we can turn on the 3D. Turn on 3D, please. Here we go. And then I'll just, come on. This is also Google Maps is such a godsend for urban planners and designers because you can quickly show how your land is, what your land is, how much land you have and how you can manage it. So if you look at Cebu City like this, you can see that the city slopes upwards into the mountain area here to the west. And then most of the development is happening here on the east where the flatlands are. Now, if you compare the built-up areas like this to the map that we saw earlier, you can see development is already like climbing up the mountains, which is supposed to be logistically very difficult. But in the Philippines, people found a way to go beyond the growth boundaries, even though it's very difficult to build, mostly because they are very strong-headed, strong-willed to build all the way up there. Now, the adverse environmental impacts include vulnerability to landslide. So constructing on a lot of these like sloping areas here really reduce the quality of the soil such that during heavy rain, which happens annually in Cebu, it triggers landslides. So you have patches of soil coming down on developed areas. The purpose of the boundary was to keep people away so they would be safe. But as you can see here, there's a development called Bonterrasas de Cebu, which is really on top of the mountains. And one key sort of negative impact here is while they were doing construction here, whenever it rained, it would flood the local community down here. And there were a lot of complaints, but since Monterrasas de Cebu was developed by a very wealthy developer, they just basically paid them to keep quiet or move out. So I think this is also happening in America as well, in a process that is popularly known as gentrification, where the local sort of low to medium income communities are pushed out by wealthy developers, and basically they have to relocate somewhere further away, making it more difficult for them to get to their jobs and also more difficult for them to even actually sustain jobs. So again, that issue of inequality where the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, urban planners and designers are here to sort of balance that out, sort of get the resources away from the rich and sort of providing it for the poor. So something like that's where the nobility of our profession comes in. It's a bit uh, lofty, but that's how I see it. Even though it might be a lot more messier in real life. Anyway, moving on, we're here. So yes, the growth boundary needs to be followed, even though it's now we can still enforce it, like slow down growth so that we don't have landslides, we reduce inequality, and we create better quality environments and also better quality of life. And then this is basically the, how do you call this? The implementation system for the Cebu City Metro Cebu Sustainability Roadmap. We would first identify a project through the Metro Cebu Development Coordinating Board, the MCDCB, basically a board of politicians, professionals, both from the academe, the public and private sector, and then they would propose their plan to the Regional Development Council, that's the RDC, and the RDC would propose it to the National Economic Development Authority. I think anyway, they handle the economics of the nation. And then that plan is checked by the Department of Finances or the DOF. And then if it's approved, it goes to what do you call this? The PPP or the Public-Private Partnership Support Fund, basically asking for money from investors. And then once the money is secured, it goes to the project manager of that project, identified by the Metro Cebu Development Coordinating Board, and then they implement that project. So a lot of checking, asking for funds, and then once the funds are secured, then they start making the project. So another issue here is the time between a proposed project being approved and getting the funds for it. A lot of the time here in the Philippines, we would propose something, we would ask for the funds for it, and the funds come like 10 years later or some a very long period of time, such that the proposal is no longer relevant and needs to be updated. That's why nothing ever gets done, or if they're done, they need to be done in small chunks. And again, as I mentioned before, the key thing here are the small chunks. That's why urban design is very important, because it's a lot smaller. Funds should be easier to secure, and then you can see the effect right away. One big example of that is Iloilo, who made a lot of several small bike lane projects. And then eventually they ended up with a network of bicycle lanes and basically won an award for it, like the Gold Award for bike lanes in the Philippines. So you can see here, these are images from Iloilo. We really don't have anything like this in Cebu. Maybe in Alcinas. Oh, I think Mandawi actually has some. You can see paint painted on the roads. What do you call this? Supposed to be bike lane, but then occupied by cars. So still a work in progress. Other sort of resources I can provide for you guys. YouTube is, especially during the pandemic, was my personal pastime. We have channels like the City Beautiful channel, Architecture with Stuart Hicks, who talk about like urban planning and design in general. We also have some like quick maps here, the citydev.de, which I can share with you now. Citydev, city citypopulation.de. And with this, you can have like a quick overview of your local community if you're not familiar with it already. So it's basically a free website with a bunch of urban designers and planners, and also QGIS mappers, basically contributing data from public public websites. In the Philippines, population data is to, where's the Philippines? Wait, did I accidentally click America? Sorry, I clicked America. Why does the Philippine flag link to the USA? I'll just type here Philippines. Here we go. Here, Visayas. And then you basically have a free GIS map where you can look at population data from all the regions, the big regions in the Philippines, and also municipalities and cities, but not all of them. For Cebu, we have one here. I'll just link it to you guys in the chat here. Oh, that's a question. Sorry, I missed your question. Or was that for the screen? Hannah? Hello? Ah, there we go. Department of Interior Local Government. Thank you.
That's all.
Yeah. Okay, good. Sometimes I really can't remember now the abbreviations. But feel free to use your microphone and interrupt me. Okay, good. It's totally fine. Let's see. Okay. So here is a sort of GIS map of the city of Cebu. You can see population density is color-coded yellow, the lightest, and purple, the densest. So with this, you can have density is a very easy kind of measurement to see how many people are living in an area. So the most dense or the most densely populated areas in Cebu City are really here in the Suba Poblacion and the Pasil area. And if you look at these areas in Google Maps, it's really the informal settlements, or not really informal because they've been there, I think, for the longest time, but the quality of living is just very, very poor, almost inhumane. So I'll just have a quick, I'll just show it quickly. Here, if my internet allows it. I'm using data from my iPhone, but I'll just zoom out of it. You can see all those tiny roofs. Those are all small houses. And then if you go down here, you take a Google search of these areas, it's very cramped. But the problem is they can't afford larger housing. So it goes back again to that issue with the need for affordable housing in Cebu City. And I think that also applies everywhere else in the Philippines and a lot of places around the world. Sydney is also known to have a housing crisis. And I think some parts of America are also experiencing that. But you can clearly see that population in Cebu City is really concentrated here in the urban areas. So if I go back to Google Maps, like so you see where all the gray is, that's where all the people are. And then if you go further away, that's where like rural areas are located and not so much activity there. A key thing with Cebu City is we don't have a lot of agricultural land. So our vegetation is really used mostly for rainwater absorption, and also our green areas here are where our natural water reservoirs are. So they need to be protected. If we build further up, we will lose our source of clean water. And then similar situations are happening in other municipalities and cities in the Philippines. Okay, and then I think that's the last of my slides. There's a few more. I think for those interested in becoming environmental planners in the Philippines, Facebook is very popular. It's where all the government officials are, and sometimes even government offices use Facebook to disseminate information and even provide maps. So we're here in the upper right, we have the Iloilo City Planning and Development Office. In the upper left is the Philippine Institute of Environmental Planners, basically the national organization for urban planners in the Philippines. We have other groups from abroad, like the Seating for Socializing. So this is where technology like social media also plays a part in urban planning and design, because it's really about getting people connected and telling them, or like informing people what are the sort of issues in our local communities. This one, Cebu Tactical Urbanism Movement, this was started by a class of mine, but we really haven't been able to update because we're all working with our own things. Some of us are starting families, so that's the main issue. We really need like a group of passionate people who are really interested in, or like not really interested, but invested in developing local communities for these kinds of groups to be sustainable or like be relevant. Because the thing with the Philippines is we have a good idea today, but 1 year, 2 years down the line, we forget about it, and then we get the same idea again, and then nothing gets done because of the again, funding, passion, communication. There's a lot of problems that really need to be that need a group of dedicated people. So this is where you guys, urban planners and urban designers, come in. So I think it's a lot easier to start with our local communities than it is to like go at the national level, try to solve national problems. So basically that's my message to you guys. That's our goal for this course. Urban design. Let's start with urban design, starting small, and then we'll familiarize ourselves with the different tools that we can apply to our urban designs. And hopefully at the end of this course, we can make some kind of report or recommendation for an area that we are interested in. And with that, it's already 2:29. I hope the recording recorded this video properly. I will share it with you guys but later tonight. And that's basically our process. We record here in the afternoon and then upload all the videos in the evening, because Google, another roadblock is Google doesn't instantaneously record the session. It takes a bit of time, like a few hours for it to record. Okay, and with that, we are done.